I've lost count of how many times I've stood beside a bed at the end of a long shift. The kind where your body is already exhausted, but your mind refuses to shut down. At that hour, the hospital changes. The hallways grow quieter, the lights dim, and the rooms seem to breathe more slowly. I walk in without making noise. The door opens gently, that soft sound of the handle turning. And for a moment, it feels like everything inside already knows what's coming. The monitor keeps its rhythm. Beep, beep, each one more spaced out than the last. The breathing isn't steady anymore. Sometimes too deep. Sometimes it falters, as if the body is forgetting how to go on. I step closer, adjust the sheets, check the signs, look at the face, and I stay. Because in that moment, there's not much left to do except be present. I've seen rooms full of people, everyone trying to fill the space, as if physical presence could make up for everything. Left undone. Whispered words, restrained tears, someone saying, "It's okay," without really believing it. And I've seen the opposite too. Empty rooms, a chair against the wall, untouched, as if it were waiting for someone who never came. But over time, I stopped focusing only on those differences, because there's something that is always the same. The silence. It arrives before the end, and takes over everything. It's not a light silence, not peaceful. It's dense, almost tangible, as if the air itself were heavier, as if each breath carried something unresolved, something left hanging in time. And the strangest part is that this silence doesn't depend on who the person was. I've been there with successful businessmen, people who built wealth, names, legacies, at least on paper. And I've been there with ordinary lives, quiet stories, people the world barely noticed. But in that moment, none of that matters, because a different kind of absence begins to show up. An absence that isn't in the room, but in the words. They don't talk about what they spent their lives chasing. No one mentions the money they made. No one asks about deals, goals, positions. No one tries to revisit professional achievements. It's as if all of it simply loses its place. And it's not that they choose not to speak about it. It just doesn't come up. As if, in the end, those things don't carry enough weight to even become a final thought. And then you start noticing something else, more subtle, but much stronger. The eyes. Some people grow restless, even when they can barely move. Their eyes search for someone. Sometimes they find them. Sometimes they don't. And when they don't, the silence becomes even heavier. Because in that moment, it's not about what is being said. It's about what can no longer be said. Apologies that were postponed. Conversations that were always left for later. Feelings that were never put into words. None of that shows up as a speech. It shows up in the silence. And the more I witnessed these moments, the more I understood that the end of life doesn't just reveal what matters. It reveals, more than anything, what never truly mattered at all. And that doesn't come through words. It comes through absence. That's when I stopped waiting for grand final words and started paying attention to what simply wasn't there. I've heard so many people talk about that moment, but always from a distance, in casual conversations during hospital visits, even in light moments, as if it were far enough away not to hurt. When my time comes, I'll ask for forgiveness. I'll say everything I've been holding in. I won't leave anything unsaid. People say this with a calm kind of certainty, almost rehearsed. As if the end of life was something organized. As if there would be time. As if we could choose the right words at the right moment. I used to think that too. Before I started witnessing these final moments up close, I believed there was some kind of final clarity. A moment when everything makes sense, when a person understands their life and finally finds the words they couldn't say for years. But that's not how it happens. Most of the time, there is no speech. There is exhaustion. Speech starts to fade days before, sometimes hours. The body begins shutting down in parts, and the voice is one of the first things to go. Words come out incomplete. Sentences don't finish. The mind tries, but it can't carry it through. And even when there's still awareness, something changes. I've seen patients who clearly had so much to say you can tell. It's in their eyes, in the way they squeeze your hand, in the effort to form a sentence. But it never fully arrives. Not because they don't want to say it, but because time is no longer responding. And that breaks completely the idea of perfect last words. Because in reality, the end is not organized. It's messy. It's slow. Sometimes overwhelmingly silent. And in many cases, when someone does manage to say something, it's not the grand revelation people expect. It's simple. Stay here. Don't go. Are you okay? Or just a name. And everything else stays trapped. In the gaze that can't hold for long. In the hand that squeezes for a few seconds and then lets go. In the silence that comes back and fills the room again. And that's when you begin to understand something difficult. Most people don't get the chance to say everything at the end. Not because they didn't want to, but because they waited for the end to do it. And the end rarely allows it. Seeing this over and over again made me realize there's a huge gap between what we imagine will happen and what actually happens in that room. And that gap changes everything. After spending enough time in these moments, you begin to realize it's not just about what people can't say. It's about what simply never shows up. It doesn't matter how long you stay in that room. It doesn't matter if the person lived a long life or had it cut short. There's a whole category of things that never enters that space. I used to wait for it. In the beginning, I thought that at some point, someone would bring it up. That between one breath and the next, something would surface about all the things that once took up years of their life. But it doesn't come. It never does. No one talks about the money they made. No one asks about assets, accounts, investments. No one tries to reaffirm status, position, recognition. And this isn't occasional. It repeats quietly in every room. I remember one patient in particular. He had built a lot: business, wealth, respect. His family talked about it outside, in the hallway, almost like they were trying to summarize who he had been. He achieved so much. He worked his whole life. But inside the room, none of that existed. He didn't mention any of it. Not once. What he did was look at the door. From time to time, with effort, he would turn his head toward the entrance, as if waiting for someone specific, someone who wasn't there. And no one talked about it. No one named that absence. But it was there the entire time, more present than any achievement they tried to recall outside. And it wasn't just him. There seen mothers calling for children who hadn't visited in years. I've seen siblings who hadn't spoken arrive too late. I've seen people surrounded by others and still alone because the one person who mattered wasn't there. And at the same time, I've never seen anyone in those moments worried about the things they once treated as priorities. It's as if, in the end, life reveals a kind of invisible hierarchy. And what rises to the top is not what we usually place there. The hardest part to accept is that this doesn't come with an explanation. No one says, this doesn't matter anymore. It just disappears dot, and what takes its place? Our presences, or absences? A name that wasn't called in time. A hand that isn't there. A conversation postponed so many times that there is no later left. And that's when you understand. The silence at the end is not empty dot, it's full. Full of everything that was postponed dot. It was only after seeing this happen so many times that I stopped trying to understand the end as an isolated moment. Because at IN single quotes T dot, what happens in that room doesn't begin there dot, it only reveals dot, it reveals in a quiet and unavoidable way how life was lived when there was still time. Because that emptiness, those things never mentioned, those absences that weigh so heavily, they don't appear out of nowhere. They were built dot, day after day dot, in postponed conversations. In we'll deal with it later. In the times work came first. In the moments pride mattered more than reconciliation. None of that feels big at the time. But in the end, that's all that remains dot. It took me a long time to accept this, because we grow up believing that what defines a life are visible achievements. The things we can show, count, accumulate. And in many ways, they take up so much space that they feel like enough. That room dismantles that idea. Without explanation, without warning dot in there, what carries weight isn't what was built outside, but what was lived between people. And it doesn't show up as a speech dot. It shows in how someone holds a hand, or doesn't. In whether a name is called or never is. In the difference between a full room and a room that still feels empty dot. And this is where the truth becomes hard to ignore dot. The problem isn't that people forget what truly matters at the end dot. It's that many never gave it enough space during life. And when the end comes, there's no time left to rearrange things dot. No time to call. No time to ask for forgiveness. No time to truly be present. The silence I see there is not an accident dot, it's a consequence. Consequence of a life that kept being postponed. Until there was no later left. And maybe the hardest part is realizing that no one notices this while they're still in the middle of living. Because on the outside, everything seems fine. But underneath, certain absences have already started forming. And they only become visible at the end dot after witnessing this so many times. I stopped walking out of those rooms the same way. I walked in. Because there comes a point where you can't ignore what the end is showing you anymore. Not as a theory, not as a distant reflection, but as something real, repeated, inevitable. I started to realize that those people weren't trying to say something grand at the end. They were trying to reach someone dot, sometimes with their eyes, sometimes with a small gesture, sometimes just with a quiet restlessness, as if they were still waiting for someone who didn't arrive in time. And that changes everything. Because, deep down, what shows up in those moments are not beautifully formed regrets dot. It's something simpler and harder to face dot. It's the lack of closeness, the absence of real presence, the time that was filled with so many things, except what actually builds connection. And the hardest part is that in that moment there's nothing left to do. Time doesn't make exceptions. The body doesn't wait. Life doesn't rewind to give one more chance. The silence that remains is final dot. And maybe that's why these moments never leave me dot. Because when I step out of that room and back into the hallway, everything keeps moving. People walking, phones ringing, routines continuing. But I know something most people aren't. Seeing that what never gets said at the end wasn't forgotten by accident dot. It was set aside long before. And that's when the question becomes unavoidable dot. Not about the person lying in that bed, but about the one still standing. the one who still has time. Because if there's one thing this work has taught me, it's that the end is not where things are fixed. It's where everything is revealed. And some things, if they're not said before, simply never come into existence at all. So maybe it's not about thinking of the end. Maybe it's about noticing now what you don't want to become silence one day.